For this generation, these two are viewed not only as a market artifact, but also as a personal and social phenomenon that can lead to independence from heavy bureaucracy. However, in trying to benefit from these changes, companies may also feed the very threat to their survival as such. This is very clear contradiction. This is a very clear contradiction that I think deserves more attention. Finally, from my point of view, these 2 points briefly raised here pose the new question for the institutionalism agenda. Are we facing the surge of new forms of governance? How they relate to the old forms? What are the consequences for social life at large? In fact, what this question encompasses is the need to go further in investigate the relationship between social, technological, and institutional changes. Thank you very much.
Well, I have also the task to comment these two presentations. Is that I'm facing the same problem you faced this morning. But let's try. This session is about knowledge and its governance. And we had two presentations for two sides of a coin that has more than two sides. It's a coin that is a kind of robotic coin. It's not a coin, it's a figure that has really many, many sides. So I started by saying that from one point of view, we had a presentation that tell us about new forms of governance and no governance, and absence of governance in the world we live, with a more free ways of spreading information and knowledge, and with several political implications. And on the other hand, the first presentation presented us forms of knowledge governance that are related to the protection of knowledge. And the protection of knowledge is just one part of knowledge governance. So I need to come back to a certain definitions to continue this conversation, because I have the impression that we have exactly 2 points. One is about the impossibility or new forms, not impossibility, actually new forms of governance we are facing through innovations that are all, we are facing a new innovative media, a new innovative system. So we have to deal with new forms of governance that were not predicted and pose some questions and challenges. On the other hand, we have knowledge in the sense of knowledge assets. And knowledge assets can be governed and has several possibilities of governance. So the important thing, I mean, and also the misleading thing, is to have a good definition for knowledge, because knowledge is embodied in several kinds of artifacts, and also has a particular, I mean, knowledge can be seen as private knowledge, and in this case is hasteless, has this potential to be, has this characteristic of being hasteless, and also is embodied in books, journals, equipment, technological and social innovations, and especially in human mind. But also, knowledge is embodied in intangibles, such company routines and organizational cultures. So if we see from this perspective, taking into account the difficulty to have a good definition for knowledge, we can define knowledge governance. We can address a new conceptual framework for knowledge governance as an analytical framework which embraces different forms of public governance mechanisms, such as supervision, rulemaking, regulation, policy prescription, and institutional coordination. And it applies to the realms of knowledge production, diffusion, and appropriation. What we are facing is new forms of knowledge, and of course, new forms of governing knowledge, and no governance for knowledge. Knowledge governance is taken so with how the deployment of governance mechanisms influences knowledge processes, such as creating, retaining, and sharing knowledge. In an analytical perspective, it has its roots in evolutionary economics and in economic sociology, and encompasses industrial and competition policy, as well as intellectual property rules and regulations, but supersedes them by trying to link all these things. What Jorge Ávila told us is this new position in the WIPO, in the World Intellectual Property Association, organization, an organization, and this new position that Brazil are taking in this arena, because we have in the past a very different position as we are less developed in a certain sense. So innovation and the protection of innovation was not such a strategic point of view in our position as a country, and now it is. So we are facing, although we are facing with new forms of knowledge, much more free, much difficult to govern, we also have some interests to protect part of the knowledge the country is creating. So we have this contradictory view that in one side, we are facing innovations in knowledge, in the production of knowledge, and on the other hand, we as a country, as innovative developing country, we need to take into account the protection of knowledge. But on the other hand, as was mentioned by Francisco, there are so new forms of governance that we just don't know anymore how to deal with these new forms of governance. So I guess that this is a very interesting agenda. I think it's an agenda that is starting to be development, has a very approach inside the firms, inside the enterprises, but has also a more broad approach that sees the knowledge governance as the mechanisms, the policies, the regulation that induces innovation, that has to be taken into account because it's an important policy mechanism to induce innovation and to make us to deal with the challenge of this intermediary income type of country that has this challenge to really surpasses this trap that is the middle income trap. And the middle income trap has to do mainly with innovation. So knowledge governance is a key issue, is a strategic issue, a strategical political issue that we have to deal because this is the question that we are facing, and not only Brazil, but mainly China. The middle income trap is a problem that innovative countries like Brazil and China are facing at this moment. So I give the floor to the audience because it's really hard to put together so many sides of a complex theme as knowledge and its governance. Vocês fizeram duas apresentações.
Well, I have a question. Is a question that actually relates both presentations. And I start from what Francisco brought to us, which is this, almost this revolution in terms of the information flow in the interaction among people. And let me call this digitalization of information and all the consequences. It's a very broad view of the phenomena. And I think this has a huge implication on the subject of Jorge, which is the regulation of the protection by means of a regulation of the creation of knowledge. So, and I have two major points that I would like to see your reaction. First, let us think the regulation of patent protection as an assignment of a property rights. So before the patent existed, we do not have the property rights of an idea, the right to exclude others for using an idea. And normally, we think that is an efficient solution to assign a property rights when the benefit from assigning it, which is the incentive to innovate, is larger than the cost of enforcing the property right. So what's the link between the internet economy and the regulation now? Is that the cost of enforcing the property rights, particularly intellectual property rights, is probably much more difficult now. I'm not referring only to industrial products, but I have in mind mainly the intellectual property of music, books, and copyrights in general. And so the enforcement is so more expensive that perhaps the solution that we had before is not the best solution anymore. So perhaps we should redefine the scope of intellectual property protection. That's one point. The second is that as we have so many fragmented properties, and in order to produce a new knowledge, you have to combine different knowledge that we had before. So the production of knowledge requires as an input the former knowledge. So we have to deal with several transactors that hold the property of other patents. That's what some economists call gridlock economy. The problem of the gridlock. So we have a difficulty of arranging all these kinds of former property rights in order to produce a new property right. So in that sense, the regulation may have a counter effect on the production of a new knowledge. So that's my main point, trying to link both presentations.
So let me begin. First, I'd like to make a very general on these issues which have been addressed by Ana Célia and then commented by Furquim. To what part of this huge thing we call knowledge does regulation, governance, appropriation relate to? And there is no easy way to answer to these questions. And I think that the most pragmatic way to answer to these questions is to say that regulation matters when economic value is the aim. This means if people are producing knowledge for increasing their human capacity of understanding the universe, or for their own satisfaction, or for whatever reason people are producing knowledge, and there are millions of reasons people produce knowledge. Probably most of this knowledge which is produced for these various reasons has nothing to do with what we are discussing, except maybe with the power of the fusion of the social networks. Even the most craziest ideas with no at all intention to make any difference in the world can be spread out through the social networks. But when it comes to knowledge, which relates to generation of value, then everything changes. And this is the realm of what we may call innovation. And it's not only technological innovation that we're talking about, it's not only about technological knowledge. So it's not only about patents, it's also about trademarks, industrial designs, copyrights. And I think that all the geographical indications, all the various forms we have invented throughout the years to regulate what we call knowledge assets, which is no other thing than extracting from the general universe of knowledge those pieces of knowledge which interest us to do business and generate value. And this becomes, of course, each time more complicated as the nature of knowledge itself is more and more complicated and easy to diffuse. There's a book which was recently launched in England, which says that for each of the industrial revolutions, or for each of the phases of this process of building knowledge to industrialize products and services, there has been necessary to develop new forms of protecting IP. I don't like very much the word protecting, because it leads our minds to think about, in a very egoistic way of thinking of, it's my piece of knowledge, it's my creation, I'm my creature, I don't know. I really prefer the idea of appropriation and the idea of building knowledge assets in order to do business. And in order to do business means, what is the second part of your questions? In an open innovation environment, to do business is to combine your creature with the creatures of other creators. And this is the way innovation is produced. And when it's no money-oriented knowledge, you can combine your creation with other no-money-oriented creations the way you wish. And nobody's going to complain. But if it has economic value, and if the nature of this combination is to produce innovation which means value, which will need to be somehow shared among you and the other creators or contributors to that creation, then there comes the necessity of building contracts. And if you need to build contracts, you need to have assets. And if the rights on these assets are not clear, you don't celebrate good contracts, and the transaction costs go tremendously high. I wouldn't say that the complication is because of the digitalization and because it spreads all over. Because digitalization at one time allows you to disseminate everything and also to supervise everything. So at once you can spread everything to everybody, and you can have the identification number of each of the persons who downloaded that piece of information. You can find the identification of their computers and their home addresses. So it's, I think that the complication and the costs have to do with the complexity of the contracts. And this, in my opinion, leads to the need of more clearly defined property rights. I think that we are facing a challenge of establishing more and more clearly the extension, nature, broadness of each kind of property right which is issued. The broad category patent, for instance, I think is almost useless, because a patent in the IT field is something very, very different from a patent in the biotech field and from a business model patent. So it's a patent in Peru may be something very different from a patent in Brazil. And so understanding exactly what's beneath these names is important, and I think that what we have been learning in the last few years is that as businesses internationalize, we really face the need of more harmonization. And this was in Brazil very complicated to accept. It's not a harmonization that every rule which is good for one country would be good for the other, but that you have to have a common language in order to be able to celebrate contracts. We have been facing one very interesting thing last year. The United States, for the first time, changed its own law in order to be more harmonized to the rest of the world in terms of patents. It was the first occasion I know where the United States decided autonomously to change its own law in order for it to be more compliant with the laws practiced in China, European Union, and Japan, and the rest of the world. So I think that I hope I have somehow commented what you raised.
I'm a bit scared about this word revolution. However, anyway, I'm talking about possibilities and not necessities. So I cannot say that's going to be a revolution, or if you are going through a revolution. However, for me, the present system of intellectual property protection, I think is not suitable for this new time. Yesterday, the Supreme Court of the United States decided that download a music is not a break in the property, the copyrights. So the evidence are very clear. And that we work in this area of innovation, institutions, and things like that, tends to see intellectual property to stressing industrial property. Maybe it's more difficult to see the problems with this side of intellectual property, the industrial property, but even this side. We are talking all the time about network innovation. Network innovation means that knowledge is created by different agents, be individuals or companies or else. How to protect the knowledge created in this form? Through laws. Because the patent is not the point, but the point is what is behind the patent, the knowledge that led to that patent. And the document, the patent document, try to show that there is something new, and at the same time hide the knowledge, the fundamental knowledge that led to that new thing. The thing is how to protect the hidden thing of the patent when you have, for instance, WikiLeaks. So for me, it's something that's going to change in the future, just as a consequence of this new pattern of communication that's going on.
The debate on the 19th on the intellectual property was polarized by two sharp positions. On one side, we had, for instance, Ha-Joon Chang and Robert Wade, who claimed that the TRIPS, for instance, closed the door for the developing countries. According to Chang, it's a typical example of kicking away the ladder. And on the other hand, inside this developmental framework, Professor Alice Amsden, for instance, claimed that the bark was worse than the bite. The TRIPS was not so terrible than some scholars thought about. And what is your impression? How have you been dealing with this challenge to deal with the promotion of innovation in a developing country that needs to respect this one-size-fits-all framework established by TRIPS treaty or TRIPS plus treaties. Is that possible to combine the necessities to create local or context-based protection of IP with this more one-size-fits-all framework that prevail in the world?
Paulo, é melhor.
Well, this discussion is very interesting because it's illustrating a challenge posed by technology to existing systems of protection of intellectual property and also to political systems. And I just, yesterday I was watching TV, the History Channel, and I saw an example that I'd like to ask you if this analogy has anything to do with the points you're posing. The story was about the invention of the cannon, the powder cannon, and according to the program, it was the main responsible for destroying the feudal castles. You had these very closed systems of property, the castles, and then the cannon destroyed and forced changes into the political systems of Europe. And we are talking about a similar technology that the internet, the web 2.0, that are forcing the changes, maybe for political reasons, were still in force, but for technology reasons, they are kind of destroying both the organization of traditional politics, political parties, and systems of governance, and also the question of intellectual property, which is becoming more and more, information is becoming more a kind of common good. It's easily transferable. And all these restrictions, legal restrictions posed on the diffusion of knowledge by an old developed intellectual property system is now having difficult to maintain. Now, I'd like you to comment if this metaphor is valid still for the points you are raising.
Well, let us see, does TRIPS bite or bark only? I think it more barks than bites, really. I think that it's been an opportunity for developing countries to learn a lot of the idea behind the IP. I think that in my experience, what I have seen, and I take my own experience, before going to the INPI, where I deal with patents and IP in general, I was to be a director of FINEP, which is the Innovation Fostering Agency in Brazil. And I have been there for 4 years. I tried to do a good job, but I had no idea on appropriability, on IP. Really, it was something that I learned during this period. I learned something. And after I learned a little bit more, I realized that I could have maybe done a better job in FINEP if I had studied a little bit more IP issues when I was there. And I think that is not a problem only of Jorge Ávila's. I think in Brazil, we did know very little about IP. I think it's a cultural problem. We did not learn how to do innovation. We learned how to copy. This was the way, our development trajectory. This is the way we developed our industries. Because the new knowledge has always been protected. It was not because we didn't know how to use it, how to deal with IP, that IP did not exist. So this is I don't really think that TRIPS has had a bad effect. I think that Rajun is wrong. Because what really happened is that TRIPS gave some, when TRIPS gave some harmonization to the environment, it made it easier to understand. It was impossible for a newcomer to understand the various IP rules of very different nature which existed all over the world. And TRIPS made it more regular, more easy to understand, more easy to deal with. And the result of this is now that China has 300,000 patents a year. Brazil will this year have almost 40,000 patents. It will have 2,000. So I think now we learned how to do business with knowledge. And then we can innovate. So I think it's quite the opposite. I think that TRIPS was a ladder, was a way to learn and to make it easy to learn. So I really think that when we are in this debate of global governance versus national sovereignties, I think we have to pay a lot of attention on the possibilities of knowledge which arise from the trial of building global governance schemes. I really don't agree with Rajun. I think that all the evidences point in the opposite direction. I have had the opportunity to be twice in 2 African fora of ministers discussing innovation and IP, and I was very much surprised on the way the African countries, some of them very poor, are dealing with innovation and trying to use knowledge, assets, and innovation to build, to overcome their poverty situation. And I think this is only possible due to a rather harmonized system of doing business with knowledge, which was established by TRIPS. On regarding the canons and maybe the digital world is breaking these old castles. I'm not totally sure that this is true. I hope it is true. But I remember Deleuze. Deleuze was analyzing in one very old book, nowadays you can say it's 20 years ago, maybe, when these technologies were emerging. And he wrote, there's the text which is in this book, I don't remember the name of the book, on the control-based societies. And what he was foreseeing was that the digitalization of the world would lead to much more control over the individuals, and not to less. When we see what's going on, I really don't know if we are in a world where individuals are to do things more freely, happy, and less supervised. I think maybe people are organizing themselves more freely, but much more supervised, much more controlled. And I think that new forms of social organization will arise. This is natural, but not necessarily more in the direction of an ideal freedom or whatever. I'm not a pessimist. I'm not against technology at all. I think that this is the way things are. I just don't really think that the basic nature of our digital revolution is to make things in principle more open to everybody. I think that there may be many new possibilities of doing things, but all of them should be ruled. And I think that if we really have these, just a thing for you to think about, the IP system exists because information was very easy to flow. There's a famous letter of an inventor who writes, I don't remember, I think it's for King George, and he says that he's invented, I don't know what, I don't remember, and he was very, very poor, though his invention was spread out all over England. Because people had just copied and nobody had paid any attention to the efforts that he had done to develop that thing. This is in the very old tradition of the justifications of the IP system, which has always been related to the facility of diffusion. And the system is proposed not as a barrier to diffusion. It's proposed as a way to organize the diffusion in order to do business. And I think that the easiest it becomes to spread over, to diffuse, the more business can be done, the more necessary organizing things for these businesses to be possible will be the case. It will be more and more necessary, in my opinion.
First, about TRIPS, I think it's a kind of worthless to complain about it, because I think it's impossible, for instance, for Brazil to go back to the old law of 1971. That opportunity was missed, I think. However, there are, I think, new opportunities for new strategies in this area with these new technologies. And I mean, not the technologies as such, but the pattern of communication that's going on with it. And about the metaphor, Paulo, I learned very early in my studies to avoid any kind of determinism, especially technological determinism. So the relation between technology and society is very complex and that's two ways, not one way. So I don't believe that the canon was responsible for that change. I think there is much more than that. But anyway, we can apply this type of analysis to what's happening now in the field of intellectual property in the drugs industry. It's changing a lot. And one of the main reasons is because society is not prepared to pay anymore for the high bill of the R&D bill built, embedded in the medicines that we buy in the pharmacies. Because of that, I think the industry is changed. And we have an example here in Brazil with the whole, the genericals and things like that. But it's not only the genericals. A lot of things going on in this industry, and has to do, in the first moment, I think, with the society saying, well, we're not going to pay anymore for that high bill. And then the enormous bill of new medicines. And then I think this process of change is not going to stop where we are at this moment. Thank you.
Just a final question. I think there is a contradiction in your talk between harmonization and the diversity of IP dimensions, intellectual property dimensions, patents, trademarks, copyrights, industrial, well, whatever. And what I really want to know, what are the proposals for a reform in the actual IP system, IP intellectual property law, in the sense that after the development agenda, what's next? Because this is really what they are discussing in the assemblies, no? I mean, there is an agenda after the development agenda, and it goes on the other direction, in the direction not of harmonization, but in the direction of a diversity of IP dimensions.
Let us see. Let us see. First, I just had a comment on this idea of that everything leaks out in the digital economy. Every year, something between 500,000 and 1 million patents remain in secrecy. Yes. And companies and inventors, researchers, and people trust that the information they codified in these patents are in secrecy. And indeed, I have never seen a leak of this information which is kept by the patent offices all over the world. And since we don't digitalize this information in the entry in order to avoid leaks, we digitalize them when they are to be published. But this is going to change because we're now going to receive the information already digitalized. But we are trying to build castles, not to be exploded by worms, viruses, and other invaders. Because the secrecy of the system is part of the system. The system provides incentive to the disclosure, but it offers 18 months secrecy as an additional prize for your initiative of disclosing. So and these 18 months are thought to be very fundamental, because otherwise no legal system would be able to fight the strong incentive provided by reality of copying immediately. So it's 18 months of secrecy, and this gap in time adds to the difficulty of making copies, which the state comes and tries to control. This is one thing. Regarding the question of Anna, is harmonization being built in the international system, or, on the other hand, diversity? I think that both things. Diversity of natures of rights. I think that there are more and more. No, but for instance, 20 years was established as a minimum, not as a pattern. So countries are free to offer more. And for instance, what's going on in the drugs, I totally agree with Professor. Nowadays, there is only incentive enough to develop drugs for what they call lifestyle drugs. There is no incentive for developing new drugs for cancer, for not to talk about what the so-called neglected disease, which in plus of this lack of will of paying for the bill, also these drugs are intended to countries where not even the basic rights are in general respected. So there's no incentive for developing drugs for these diseases. I remember I made a speech before I went to the INPI, which was a neglected disease. It was a seminar organized by Fiocruz and Correa, the government of France. Professor Benjamin Correa was there. And it was on neglected diseases and IP. And I opened my speech with a slide that was called Neglected Diseases. Who are the neglectors? Who is not doing what should be doing? Because private companies should invest in the fields where their stockholders want them to invest. This is their role. Regulators have to provide the adequate institutional conditions for those who need to do research in the field of neglected diseases to find enough incentive to do so. So it was, in truth, the neglected diseases are neglected by those who do not promote an adequate environment which is able to grant incentives to anybody to develop research in these fields. It's not that Fiocruz is a bad institution. It's not because Bayer is a bad company. It's not because UFRJ is a bad university that none of these institutions do research in the necessary amount on neglected diseases. It's because the environment is not good enough to make it viable for UFRJ, Fiocruz, and Bayer to do the sufficient and necessary amount of research on these fields. And if this is the case, we have to make a question, redirect a question, to what kind of environment is this one which would produce these incentives? And this has much to do with the creation of new IP rights. I don't think that extending the duration of patents will be the solution. You have to grant the adequate patent protection and possibly generate other kinds of incentives, other kinds of rights. And so now there are many possibilities of building these property rights, which in the end have to do, how can we do for some people who are not willing to pay for the bill, be helped by other people to pay the bill? Because if the bill has to be paid, if no one pays the bill, no research will be done because it has a bill. It costs money. Someone has to pay. If the user does not need to pay the bill, he does not use it anymore, that much, probably. Or maybe he cannot pay the bill. And then you should find a way to incentivize other people to help them pay the bill. But this, I think that these questions are not easy. I think that we have to address this in a very systematic way. What I see going on is that the kind of harmonization we have been seeing, which is being built, and what I think is good for developing countries, is the simplification of laws, is making the laws more easy to understand by everybody, and easy to interact one with the other. But they multiply the new various kinds of IP protection, and I think that this is this will be the way. We will not protect nanotechnology innovations with traditional patent system. We will not be able to protect the new advances in the digital environment with the traditional copyright system. So I think we will need really innovation, institutional innovation, in order to make it viable to produce the necessary incentives for people to invest money in building innovation and in combining what they build with others' creations. And this has always been the objective of the system, and I think a lot of creativity is going to be needed for so.
Questions? Any other questions? We have some minutes, no?
Unusual year for organizing this workshop actually is our 6th edition. And we had a lot of unexpected events, and I will not enumerate them, but I'm really happy and glad that we came up with a very interesting conference at the end. And I think it would be impossible to do this without our network. We had 4 excellent international guests. Normally have just 2, so in that sense, we have an improvement. And also, we had an excellent discussion during the sessions. I was really proud to be part of this organization, despite all the difficulties we had this year. And I think we have the benefit at the end, not only of the conference, but our network is stronger now. It's larger and it is stronger. And it's mainly based on trust and friendship. I think our friendship is perhaps all our most valuable asset. And first, I would like to, as my last word, is to thank Ana Célia for being such a nice and lovely host for all of us. So please, let's give a hand.
Thank you. But before ending the conference, the workshop, I need to thank some people at the organization. First, Bernardo. Bernardo, where is Bernardo? No, the other, Bruno. Yes, Bruno. Cláudia. Bianca. Is Bianca here? No. Wellington at the end. Then you'll see the videos of this conference in the pages. And so we'll have the pleasure to review everything. As I said at the very beginning, this workshop, this network is very particular and very important for all of us because it has a very good agenda, has this effort to combine different positions and to be happy to discuss them. And I have the impression that we did a very good job in all these days, and not in terms of convergency, but in terms of understanding much more our rich agenda. And I hope we continue to do this, because this is really a very special network. So I thank all of you, and I thank all the friends, Silvia, who did a very good job, Paulo, Elizabeth Farina, Sandro, all of us that worked together, and was a very good result, I must say. Thank you for all. And next year, I hope we have, what are the decisions for the next year? Or in Siena. Or in Siena, because we're in doubt of it. Because we have received an offer to do this in Siena. Maybe we should do two meetings. Why not? Yeah, because we need to continue to do it in Brazil. So maybe we can organize two meetings. Why not? Why not? That's a good idea. So we have the opportunity to share this initiative with other other colleagues abroad. So this will be a very good idea. Okay? Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hello, everybody. Let's move to our last session, and we have a pleasure to have here the keynote speech of Professor Geoffrey Hodgson. Professor Geoffrey Hodgson is one of the most prominent researchers in the area of institutional economics, particularly the original institutional economics. And among his several qualities, I think one is particularly important, is, at least in my view of his work, is his ability to look at the economic system in its entirety, both the production of knowledge of economics, of new ideas of economics, and also the economic system in reality. And he always tries to link the production of the knowledge in economics with the real economic system. So let's get started. Please, Jeff, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here again. Thank you for the invitation. It's been a great conference. One of the great things about this conference has been the wide-ranging, interdisciplinary character, focusing on shared problems and an agenda which is clear, but actually bringing different insights and backgrounds together. So perhaps my talk may relate to this, because I'm going to talk about disciplinary boundaries and the changing disciplines. So a little bit of history of ideas, and then some discussion about the sociology of professions, if you like, sociology of disciplines. And then we can open it up for discussion. Okay, you may not know who this guy is. He's some obscure Frenchman, Auguste Comte, who actually invented the word sociology. He invented some other words we take for granted, like altruism as well. He was fantastically influential, not only in France, but also in Britain and other parts of Europe. He was influential in Brazil because Brazil has one of the few flags with a slogan on it, order and progress. You got it from this guy, okay. Anyway, that's a bit about him. He defined sociology, basically the study of society, which seems consistent with the obvious etymology of the word. Economics as a term was not then prevalent. Political economy was the more common term. And he addressed its meaning. It was secondary and subsidiary discipline. Mind you, he had no axe to grind. He wasn't, a chair. He wasn't sort of pushing down the economists. He said, well, the whole society is sociology. And political economy is concerned more particularly within that with the production and distribution of wealth. Okay? Seems reasonable. Now, cut a long story short, the next important guy I'll consider now, we could discuss many other guys along the way, men or women, but is Marshall, with a very interesting definition of economics. Marshall is important because of his influence and also the power of his ideas. I think he still repays close reading. But anyway, this is his definition and his principles of what economics or political economy is. Political economy or economics is the study of mankind and the ordinary business of life. It examines that part of individual and social action which is most closely connected with the attainment and with the use of the material requisites of well-being. It's not a clearly bounded area of study, but it's kind of focused on business and wealth creation. In that way, it's quite consistent with Comte. In fact, there's evidence from Marshall that he had read Comte. So no change there. Now, the change comes with contemporaries of Marshall. I'll give you two examples. One is Jevons, of course. Jevons' major publication, 1871, is before Marshall, but there's a kind of parallel discourse, even though they're lumped together as neoclassical economists, they're actually quite different. So Jevons, is 1879, a later work or a later edition. Economics must be pervaded by the tracing out of the mechanics of self-interest and utility. And that becomes a definition of what economics is about later. Edgeworth, similar line of argument. The first principle of economics is that every agent is actuated only by self-interest. So we narrow down economics not just as a study of a real object, but by its assumptions. Okay, so the science is not only defined by its object of analysis, which is business, but also by the assumptions you make. And this becomes a feature of later economics. And I quote this a lot because it's a nice quotation. The conception of man as a pleasure machine may justify and facilitate the employment of mechanical terms and mathematical reasoning. I mean, it's all in there, isn't it? This sort of little germ of an idea that economics should become a mathematical science based on utilitarian principles, foreshadowing much of economics in the 20th century. Now, to cut a long story short, the next big milestone, there's many changes along the way, but I'll make it as simple as possible, is this guy here, an early photograph of Robbins, later to become Lord Robbins, the London School of Economics. His book of 1932, Essay on the Nature of Significance of Economic Science, is a very important restatement of what economics should be about. Again, if you're interested in this, it will pay his reading because he discusses different definitions which are current at the time, including Marshall's, and pushes them aside to advance his own definition, which has also a pedigree. It's influenced by Austrian thinking and by others. For Robbins, economics is a social science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means, which have alternative uses. The science of choice notion of economics. Now, I don't know when and where you studied your economics, but if you opened any textbook on economics between roughly 1950 and more recently, 9 out of 10 of them would say economics is the science of choice. Okay, that would be the conception. You assume preferences and you trace out the relationship between ends and means with given preference functions and using a choice theoretic framework. Now, my point here is this is relatively new, okay? And it's also a opposition to Marshall. I mean, I'm constantly lectured by people in the economics department that I'm not an economist. Then my response is, how do you define economics? Well, it's a science of choice. Also, well, you're not a Marshallian then, are you? I'm a Marshallian economist, okay? I define economics in the terms that Marshall does. But this became the convention for economics, much of the post-war period. But actually, it wasn't immediate. Robbins' ideas were struggled against. And there's a nice article on this by Roger Backhouse and Stephen Medimer. And they show, by looking at the textbooks, that it wasn't until about the 1960s that this formulation became completely prevalent. So anyone who stands up and says this is economics is being rather dogmatic and ignoring the history. Now, So that's a very rough and quick sketch of definitions of economics. I'll come back to the definition of economics later, but now let's look at sociology. Okay? Here's an interesting character, a contemporary, writing seminal works in the 1930s of Robbins and also corresponding with Robbins, very interestingly. Now, prior to Robbins, sociology was not a well-developed discipline. It existed, at least in most universities, in the English-speaking world, there were beginning to be economics departments. Professional Association of Sociologists, American Sociological Association, was set up in around the turn of the century, about 1900, and it sort of was around as a discipline in some universities, but unclear of its own identity. Very much affected by biological thinking and anthropological studies on humans and so on. What Parsons did was to completely change the conception of sociology, at least in the US, okay? Completely change its conception. And he did this by writing a whole generation of American sociologists out of the script. I mean, so there were American sociologists, American sociological journals writing prolifically before the First World War, and these are completely forgotten. People like Lester Frank Ward, Giddens and others, Gittings, I get the two confused, and others were prolific writers, Edward Ross, all these people. Most sociologists haven't read them. They're not asked to read them, okay? But thanks to Parsons, we airbrushed early American sociology out of the script, okay? So he redefines sociology. He was trained as an economist, and he was trained as an old institutional economist, but thought it wasn't a very good career move because he happened to be in Harvard, and he wouldn't get anywhere because Harvard was one of the places where old institutionalism was unpopular. It was more popular in Columbia and in Michigan and places like that. So Harvard was an anti-old institutionalist outfit in economics. So he couldn't advance his career. This is rather a cynical interpretation of what he's doing, but he couldn't advance his career in economics, this old institutionalist background, which impressed upon him the importance of culture and values and all these things. So he invents the sociology department in Harvard. Okay, he becomes part of a move to set up a separate sociology department, which he does. And he writes out, he airbrushes out of the script his own intellectual history and dismisses the old institutionalists, okay, as well. So a lot of this baggage goes overboard. And there we have new and clean and straight from nowhere, as if straight from nowhere, Parsonian sociology, which creates the great leaders, Durkheim, Marx, Weber, and one or two others, as the founders of the science. Ironically, as I said this morning, Max Weber was an economist, okay? But for Parsons, this becomes the conventional sociology. And it's defined more narrowly as a science concerned with the property of common value integration in society, which is Parsonian, awful English. He's a very unclear writer, in my view. Anyway, what he's trying to do is to negotiate an agreement with the Robbins-inspired definition of economics, where Robbins takes values and preferences as given, and the sociologists explain their origin and change and so on. So it's a wonderful division of labor. And the result of the Robbins-Parsons Concordat, which was not signed and agreed as a contract, but it was a result of conversations between them, was that economics and sociology were each concerned with an aspect of the system as a whole. So this is a contrast between the Comte-Marshall view. The Comte-Marshall view is sees sociology as a study as a whole, and economics is a domain within, an important domain, or the most important domain, if you like, within that whole. By contrast with Robbins and Parsons, you have the whole, and they're both looking at different aspects of the whole, rather than different domains within it, okay, or subdomains within it. And this dominates sociology, just as Robbins's view dominates post-war economics. But things have changed since. The sociology itself has changed. And in modern sociology, you can find extensive use of rational choice theory. Okay, so Coleman's sadly dead now. Coleman writes a very influential text which really just rips out standard neoclassical rational choice theory and puts it in sociology. And that becomes popular after the breakdown of the influence of Parsons. Once Parsons is displaced as the sort of patron saint of post-war sociology, this is one of the things that happens. And this contrasts completely with the previous Parsonian view, which ruled from, say, the 40s to the 70s. Now, the problem then for sociologists is if you say, well, if sociology is acknowledging the Parsons-Robbins distinction or definitions of the subject, and economists under Robbins define their subject as the application of rational choice methods, then Coleman is doing economics and not sociology, okay? Unless you change the definitions. Now, once I asked Coleman this question, he said, aha, but they haven't got the concept of social capital, okay? But unfortunately for him, sadly, as I say, he's not around to carry on this conversation, social capital is a concept which economists have also embraced. So I see no difference between what he's doing and many sociologists. Of course, he brings his own insight and originality, but basically the framework is ripped out of standard neoclassical economics. Likewise with game theory, you know, becomes sort of trendy and fashionable in economics, important, and let's not be silly about it, and sociologists take it over as well. So the end of the Parsonian consensus in sociology means all these changes. So what is the difference now between economics and sociology, unless they're redefined? Now, that's the question I've asked sociologists, and I continue to ask, but I don't get a clear answer. Let's look at economic sociology, because that complicates the picture still more. Economic sociology as a term has a long history, both in German and English, and also in French, going back well into the 19th century. But it is never really a sort of defined movement. People use it as a term to define aspects or types of theory. Schumpeter used it that way, for example. What's significant is economic sociology becomes a very important movement in the 1980s, roundabout, particularly in the United States, but very influential with people like Zelizer and Granovetter and all these other people. And I think their work is very interesting and actually is sadly neglected by many economists. So I take their work very seriously because I think they've made a very big contribution. But what my concern is, again, meanings of words. My worry here, and I'll explain why I'm worried about meanings of words and definitions of subjects later, is what they mean by the term economic sociology. You could argue that this new subdiscipline, it's now a registered group within the American Sociological Association with large meetings and lots of members. So it's quite important and influential and institutionalized, but I'm yet to understand what it is, okay? And so you can ask people like Zelizer and you get answers like this. Economic sociology offers a sociological account of economic phenomena, more specifically the production, consumption, distribution, transfer of assets, goods and services. Now, sounds straightforward until you look a bit closer. First question, what is a sociological account? Well, I actually emailed Viviana and asked her what she meant by a sociological account. You can sense the frustration in the email, you know, coming back, oh, you know, get on with real work and stop nitpicking. It's using sociological methods, okay, so stupidly I carried on. What do you mean by sociological? Well, you know, we know what they mean. Just look in the sociological journals and get on with some useful work. She didn't say that, but you could sense the frustration. And the other part of the story is, what do you mean by economic phenomena? Okay, if you take the Robbins definition of what you mean by economic phenomena, they're choice situations. Okay, if you take the Marshallian definition of what economic phenomena are, they're more narrowly defined as business. And she seems to suggest the latter by the rest of the sentence. Okay, but it's unclear, or at least seems to be innocent of any discussion of that. Swedberg also a prominent economic sociologist and friend of mine. Economic sociology is usually defined as an attempt to analyze economic phenomena with the help of sociology. That is, with the help of sociological concepts and theories, okay? So I annoyed him as well. I emailed him and said, dear Richard, what do you mean by sociological concepts and theories? Well, I did get some kind of answers, and I'll come up with it in a minute, but it wasn't a very adequate answer. What do you mean by economic phenomena? Well, there it was more clear. It means business kind of stuff, which is a Marshallian notion of economic. Okay, I said, that's fine, but I'm still unhappy that you're not telling me what sociological concepts and theories. Now, I'll come to that again in a minute. But it raises this question, whether we define disciplines in terms of their objects of analysis, as Marshall did and Comte did, all right, or in terms of their theories and methods. I've already raised this problem because when sociologists are using methods in economics and economists use methods to define their discipline, that creates a demarcation problem for sociologists and indeed for economists. If it's about objects of analysis, then you can make the case sociological economics. You're applying the methods of sociology, whatever they are, to economic phenomena. So again, irritating emails to these people. Why not say, oh, stop quibbling with terms, you know. But I will quibble with terms because words are power, okay? Labels mean power. Labels mean money, positions, getting in journals, getting published. Labels are important, okay? So what are economic phenomena? I've raised that issue already. And what are sociological concepts and theories? So we don't know. Well, let's put some candidates up, okay? So embeddedness, right? Great article, classic article by Granovetter, leading American economic sociologist, 1985. On the concept of embeddedness. If you haven't read it, read it. It's a great article, okay? So does this characterize economic sociology? Well, the problem is we don't know what embeddedness means. And Fligstein, who's another leading American economic sociologist, reports that empirical literature has failed to clarify the precise nature of social embeddedness. It's something to do with being connected with society, or the economic and society being connected, but we don't adequately define what we mean by social or the economic, and it gets very fuzzy and ambiguous, okay? And this is the result of an exponent saying that. And Granovetter himself, I rarely use embeddedness anymore because it's become almost meaningless, stretched to mean almost anything, so therefore means nothing. So these are the exponents of economic sociology, so I can make my case through them. It doesn't really adequately define what they're doing. So we have another feature of the story. There's other concepts as well you could look at, but there's no clear notion of what sociological concepts and methods are in these terms. Let's look then at the economic imperialism thing. What happened long after Robbins, when the science of choice framework became the norm, the convention within economics, is you had this Chicago initiative from Becker and others in particular to use the science of choice, the techniques of neoclassical choice theory, the models and approaches, to extend them to other domains. Now, Robbins had said that right from the beginning, that that's what could be done. Right? He didn't confine economics to business phenomena. But Becker took this, and it's called economics imperialism, or economic imperialism in some accounts, of making economics an all-embracing subject, which again raises questions of boundaries. And strangely, an inversion occurred with the rise of behavioral economics. The economists actually became more critical of rational choice from the 1990s, while sociologists adopted it. So they almost changed places. And when I was at the LSE about 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, perhaps, and there was a debate, and I was with Peter Abel, who is a sociologist at the LSE, and I'm a nominally economist, I never counts as an economist. But anyway, the irony is I was attacking rational choice theory and he was defending it, okay? So it's almost as if we're in the wrong department by earlier definitions. Basically, we have no understanding of what sociology is anymore. No one can point to sociological methods. Likewise, economists are also vague about what constitutes their discipline. The Robbins-type definition is still prominent, but it's actually less evident than it was. I'll come to a bit of evidence on that in a minute. So the important thing is we have no consensus about the boundaries anymore. Now, isn't that significant? Shouldn't we then be looking over the disciplinary boundaries and looking at publications in the American Journal of Sociology, and sociologists likewise looking at economics, and we can learn a lot from economic sociology and so on, but arguably very little of that's going on. One is that so? Well, one is a problem of what we call institutional lock-in, okay? If the substance in the departments is overlapping, actually addressing similar problems, but not talking to the other people, but at the institutions of the disciplines, which is the organization of the departments, the journals to which people want to publish in, the career hierarchy within the institutions, both within any particular institution and more generally globally, have these divisions, then people will not span them both. They won't, it would be costly to try and keep a foot in both camps. So people concentrate on one, they specialize, and they ignore what's going on elsewhere. And this is a tragic outcome of this division. And the institutions of academia lock this in. And this creates what I call problems of isolation. There's evidence here from an article in an economics journal of how economists cite other journals. Peters and Baumgartner. This is interjournal citation papers in the mid-90s, and found that economics builds only slightly on knowledge from its sister disciplines, okay, from closed disciplines like psychology and sociology in particular. Very little discussion of what's going on in those other disciplines. And that must be to the detriment of economics. And here's some, from the other side, I've criticized economics, let me criticize sociologists. And these are sociologists who I respect a lot, because I think their work is very important. One example will be Fligstein, and I'll give you the quotation, I'll tell you why I'm quoting it. This is from his book on markets. Economic theory begins with the idea that individuals are profit maximizers. If social actors are profit maximizers, then social relationships are by definition efficiency enhancing. Now, if any mainstream economists picked that up, they would put the book down immediately on the grounds that the guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And unfortunately, on this issue, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I don't know of a single economist that assumes that individuals are profit maximizers, right? Yes, utility maximizers, but utility is not the same as profit, okay? And when you're talking across the disciplines, you have to be precise. You have to know what you're talking about, okay? So if you're describing economists, you have to be accurate in what you're doing. And if you're inaccurate, then people are going to disregard you. So unfortunately, despite the stature of this guy, he gets it wrong. And he says, if social actors are profit maximizers, wrong premise, then their social relationships are by definition efficiency enhancing, which is also wrong, okay? There's a standard literature in economics, even if we were profit maximizing, we wouldn't necessarily be efficient, okay? For many reasons, externalities, prisoner dilemma situations, all sorts of things like that, okay? So simply doubly wrong within one passage. And this does damage. This prevents people reading because you don't know what you're talking about, right? And we should read that. It's a good book. We should read it, okay? Another one, Thomas Beach and Nicole Bigart, again, two big names in American sociology. Keynesian economists have widely favored the use of equilibrium models. Well, it's about best a half-truth. I mean, if you say Keynesian economics has, the economics, or economists calling themselves Keynesian have equilibrium models, that's true, but not more than neoclassical economists, because they're the addicts of equilibrium, okay? And if you talk about Keynes, Keynes was anti-equilibrium. I mean, the whole model is dynamic. So this really is either half true or misleading or both, right? Again, it's a problem. So the question, I think, on the agenda, whether it will be actually ever asked or dealt with, is this. So the should disciplines refer again to Comte and Marshall to determine their boundaries, which seems to be where we're heading back to, because we've abandoned the old ways of defining these subjects. Well, if desirable, is this possible? Which raises questions of power. Well, I did a Google search in the last half hour, and the top Google entry to the answer, what is economics, you may be surprised. It's not the science of choice. Neither, you have to go quite a way down to get the science of choice. You get something like this. Economics is a study of the production and consumption of goods and transfer of wealth to produce and obtain those goods. Well, a little bit clumsy, but it's fine by me, okay? It's got a very Marshallian flavor to it. So we've got the sort of hidden return of Marshall in sort of standard, at least web-based stuff on what economics is about. And it's even back in the textbook, so perhaps there's some grounds for optimism. There's no Robbins here, there's no science of choice stuff. Is it back to Marshall? Well, that's a bit of optimism. Let me give you the pessimistic side, okay? The pessimistic story must be based on what we might call the sociology of science, and which is the study of how science as a set of institutions and individuals actually operates, okay? And obviously it's naive to believe that all that matters is the ideas, because science is also about power, and science is also about access to resources. That doesn't mean I don't believe in science. I don't reduce it to a power game. I'm not one of these Edinburgh philosophers of science. I think science is real, and I think science is important. I think science changes the world possibly, or allows us to intervene in the world to improve it. So I'm not taking that view, but I am also recognizing that you can say things which are ignored, and a lot of good stuff in science doesn't get a hearing because of the power structures in the profession. Now, anyone who's tried to publish in a journal will know what I'm talking about, okay? You think you've got a great article and a great argument, and you get a rejection slap. It's happened to us all. Now, that's the way science works. Now, one of the best books on the philosophy and sociology of science, I think, in my recent reading is this one by Kitcher, an American philosopher of science. And what he does is bring together the two great disciplines and the two great questions and agendas in science studies. One is, what is the scientific method? And the other one is, how does science work? And he brings those together. And he says, like the post-Popperian view of science, by and large, there's still some Popperians around, but by and large is that there's no such thing as a scientific method. There's a set of methods which people use, and the balance of authentication actually changes between people. So it's dogmatic and wrong to say there's such a thing as a scientific method. That's no longer, well, if you believe there is, show me it, and show me a philosopher of science that believes in it, and you'll have a problem, okay? It's not that simple. But this doesn't mean, according to Kitcher, there's not such a thing as science, and there's not such a thing as science intervening in the world and making progress. The way it does that is a social process. It creates a social community in which people develop and contest ideas, and some ideas gain the consensus and others remain on the fringes or even thrown out of the discipline. And it's through that process, imperfect as it is, that science progresses. Your work is scrutinized, your arguments are put under discussion, just as we've been doing for the last 2 days. You know, what do you mean by this? What's your data? You know, that kind of question is relevant for a scientific community. And bit by bit, we get persuaded of certain approaches, and we dismiss others and so on. So it's an evolutionary process. It involves selection and rejection. Okay? So another key feature of the argument then is that you have a scientific community. Science is necessarily elitist. It's not democratic. You can't do science by votes. If we did, we wouldn't have to be doing anything about climate change, because the majority of the world's population don't believe in the theory of climate change, right? As we know. It's necessarily an elite thing. It has to live within a democracy, but it's an elite process, because it requires some process of induction and training to get into that scientific community and to be recognized and to be powerful within the process of selecting and rejecting what's right and what's wrong, or what's believed to be right and what's believed to be wrong. And so what he comes up with is the concept of optimal diversity. Right? Optimal diversity within a discipline. In other words, if you have too much diversity, you have difficulty creating a consensus about key concepts, and the discipline cannot progress very much. If you have too little diversity, then you have a great consensus and you may be churning out models and theories, but you don't innovate because you reject innovation. Innovation disturbs the consensus that's already there. Because the kind of optimal diversity is just enough to create the possibility of change in the consensus position without upsetting the process by which consensus is gained. Now, if you look at economics and sociology, I guess we might be unanimous in saying that one discipline has too much consensus within economics departments, and another discipline lacks consensus, right? And respectively, economics and sociology. Economics within economics departments has too much consensus. They reject anyone who doesn't put the stuff in a model. They reject anyone who doesn't take... you can now challenge rational choice theory, but you have to do it within strict protocols. You can't talk about uncertainty in the Knight Keynesian sense. You have to talk about decision biases and that kind of phraseology in behavioral economics, even though you can challenge rational choice. And anything else is rejected out, okay, screened off. Yet there is consensus. By contrast, in sociology, with the collapse of the Parsonian paradigm, the Parsonian consensus, sociologists are constantly at war with each other and lack, they just go into subgroups and proselytize particular positions and sub-consensuses within the discipline, okay? And the establishment of consensus within the discipline as a whole has become very difficult. Now, the picture is then complicated by the fact that you've got economics going on outside economics. You've got economics going on outside economics departments. So this is a donut phenomenon, okay? It's a donut phenomenon where the whole is empty in the middle, and all the sort of real-world engaging economics, or a lot of it, is being done around the periphery, in business schools, in innovation centers, in departments of geography, some of it in sociology, economic sociology, and so on. So you've got this donut with an empty hole. And the Marshallian notion of the subject would provide its community in the current donut and less so in the core, right? Because Marshall didn't like people who were simply obsessed with modeling. So you have optimal diversity, the need for elite consensus as well as disciplinary variety, and that's lacking in both disciplines. There's also questions, certain strategies which are around concerning pluralism. I was one of the people involved in setting up the organization called the International Confederation of Associations for Pluralism in Economics. Originally was Reform in Economics, which I prefer as a title. But this suggests that pluralism is not a solution in itself. Pluralism would be a solution if we were in economics departments fighting for greater diversity, but we're not. Most of us are now outside economics departments. Even the new institutionalists, people like Claude, are outside economics departments. Prominent American new institutionalists like John Nye have gone into law, business, these kind of places, because the kind of work being done is not conducive to the ultra-modeling protocol that goes on. So appealing to pluralism may be helpful, but it doesn't seem to be sufficient to deal with this problem. And this has implications for both disciplines and also for attempts to organize heterodoxy, okay? I will personally be pleased, I'm personally pleased when I see conferences organized by heterodox economists which are going to discuss important things, okay? But I do not believe this is the way to change the discipline. Why? Because you will not get a consensus-forming mechanism. There's more diversity in heterodoxy than there is in orthodoxy. Much more, and getting a consensus-forming mechanism is the key to actually either changing economics itself or creating a new disciplinary forum where a Marshallian view of inquiry can be pursued. So finally, I'll end with an advertisement, which is for the Journal of Institutional Economics. And we could have called it the Journal of Institutional Sociology or the Journal of Institutional Economic Sociology or all sorts of things, but the object of analysis here is institutions, okay? So this is an attempt to span disciplines, but actually it may put off sociologists submitting. Fortunately, we do get some good sociologists submitting stuff, and we'd like more, okay, because we're interested in studying institutions. But it illustrates the problem. You know, what do you call a journal that is trying to be interdisciplinary and trying to get the attention of many people working on similar problems who are located in different disciplines? So you choose institutional economics because that's a historically well-known term. But again, it's the problem. The advertisement is to say, if you're a sociologist and you're interested in institutions, you can publish good articles in this journal. You don't have to be an economist. But the problem is we have economics in the title, or perhaps that's an asset too. So again and again, we have to reproduce these disciplinary labels. And so that's why I'm quite pessimistic. It will take an adventurous dean or vice chancellor or president in a very good university to say, look, let's abolish these distinctions and have the Department of Social Science, and within it we can have divisions dealing with different issues. One is going to study business life, and the other one can just study identity or whatever other things sociologists study, and do it that way. But as yet we see no sign of it. And the mechanisms of funding, the journals, the access to advancement in the professions remain divided on grounds which are no longer have any justification in terms of rationale. There's no justification for this distinction between economics and sociology, yet it will persist. Well, this is talking about words, but it's also talking about power, and it's talking about conferences like this, because this conference is about organizations, and people from both disciplines and elsewhere have important contributions to make. So we will have to live with this problem, and I think the more we think about it, perhaps one day we'll find a solution. But I can't see it on the horizon yet. So welcome what you think about it. Thanks very much for your time.
Hello, thanks for the presentation. Really, really nice. I'm from the management field, and we oftentimes use a more phenomenological approach, meaning that, say, I'm interested in, I don't know, alliances. So let me pick whatever theory can explain that phenomenon. So it's very common to find papers, for instance, drawing from transaction cost economics and then resource-based view, and then economic sociology embeddedness. So do you think that that approach can help that process of integration, meaning that we don't say, I mean, I'm an economist or I'm a sociologist, but we say I'm an alliance guy, or I'm interested in solving the commons problem or whatever, or contracting problem in general. I will try to find the best tools to actually analyze that situation.
Thank you. That was really very interesting. I want to introduce a different variable here to, let's say, to put a little bit more conflict in the discussion. And this is exactly referring to the Parsonian hiatus, let's say, in sociology. Another way of looking at it is that in reality, Parsons was mainstream in America, but it was not. The 70s and the 80s were also very active in sidelining or pushing aside this Parsonian phenomenon, essentially because it was thought that the essential thing about sociology was the idea of the social process based on the individual arbitrariness of the social act. And Parsons got rid of two very fundamental things: the idea of the individual social act and the idea of conflict. And the whole issue of sociology and its potential relationship with political economy came vis-a-vis the concept of conflict. I mean, how do you administer situations of power? After all, social processes are situations of administering or legitimating power. So I'd like to see how you could...
Yes, I thought this concept of optimal diversity very interesting. And I have two questions about it. First, is there any relation of this concept with the trade-off that was pointed both by Nelson Winter and Douglas North between stability and change, the first question, because it seems to me that or too much change with various approaches and almost no change with just a monolith approach. And the second question is optimal, everything that use the word optimal give us the notion of maximization. And I was thinking if it wasn't better to call it equilibrium, diversity, instead of optimal. Because if it's really optimal, it should be maximizing. Something I'd like to know what it would be maximizing.
Okay, I really enjoyed the speech, thanks. It's more a comment than anything else. I wonder if you have followed a little bit of the criticism inside sociology towards Coleman. Specifically, of course, it's easy inside sociology with a bunch of sub-consensus that you have pointed out. There have many people criticizing rational choice inside, but specifically the mathematical sociology, right? So Ferraro and then Harrison White, and there's some few people which I think it probably is worth considering carefully in your assessment.
Yeah, the first question was about business schools. Yes, I think business schools, in a sense, offer some forum for people working together from different disciplines, working on common problems. Okay, and I'm in a business school, and I very much approve and benefit from that kind of environment, where we work from different disciplines on common problems. We have an interdisciplinary work group, and that's fine. The problem, though, is where do you publish your stuff? Okay, you've got different people. Is it going to be? I mean, you could choose something like the journal, the Socioeconomic Review, or something like that, which explicitly spans disciplines. The problem is, if you're an economist, you'll get no brownie points for publishing in that journal, even though it's quite a good journal and it's got Thomson Reuters listing and all the rest of it, right? And if you're a sociologist, you'll be better off publishing in a different journal for similar, not identical reasons. The sociologists want to publish in the Sociological Review or American Journal of Sociology, and the economists want to publish in the prestigious Economics Journal. And that's the problem. You know, to advance your careers, people are going to say, what are you? An economist or a sociologist? Okay, you're an economist. What journals in economics have you published in? And it just tears the groups apart. So you get great work being done. The problem is the different disciplines intrude on the problem. On the second question, I agree entirely. I missed out a whole episode in the destruction of the Parsonian consensus, which involved a number of critics, including Marxists, which criticized Parsonian sociology for being rather conservative and not including conflict. That was an important phase in the development of post-war sociology, and Marxism is a strong current in sociology alongside many other currents now. And to comment on the last one, I accept the points you make about mathematical sociology and so on. So sociology is an extremely diverse field, but it does include Marxists. Economics doesn't anymore. It did for a while in the 70s, but if you're a Marxist, don't try and get a job in the economics department. You will fail, at least in my country or America. You just won't get anywhere. Unless you do rational choice Marxism, in which you may have a chance, okay, but even there you may have a problem. Your point about optimal diversity, yes, I also hesitate about that phrase. It's Kitcher's phrase. Perhaps sufficient diversity would be a better term, or diversity that satisfies using a Simonian notion. Of course, you can never get optimal diversity, and that's rather misleading for the reasons I think we may share. And the continuity and change thing, I think, would relate also very closely to Kitcher, who raised, because consensus building does involve continuity. You can't sort of change the consensus every fortnight. And that means there's a strong conservative element in science, which sometimes is a pain, That means that science doesn't change, but on the other hand, it's necessary because you have to establish all the detail of the consensual operation before you can move on and change it. So yeah, this is a balance between continuity and change. So I agree with that kind of formulation. But I'd be interested in your reaction to what way Kitcher argues it. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I enjoyed it so much that when you got to number 16, I was sad, and then when you got 2 bonus questions that made me happy. I have 2 comments and 1 question. The first is, it's very easy in Brazil, the difference between economists and sociologists. Very easy. The sociologists are all left-wing, and the economists are a little bit less left-wing. Please don't be offended, anybody. I don't know why or which way you'd be offended. But, another comment is about, I don't know, 10 years ago, the economists had this leader or saying, the title was 99.9% of sociology is bunk. And what their point was that sociologists use surveys. And then that, because you can't believe nobody tells the truth when they answer surveys. And it's interesting that now these days, a lot of economists are using, because with this thing trying to quantify institutions and other kind of things, like the governance matters, World Bank, a lot of economists use that, and it's all based on surveys. So now 99% of economics is bunk too. Okay, so now for my serious question is you didn't mention anything about beliefs, but I was very interested in knowing your notion of beliefs. A lot of economists are trying to incorporate this idea of beliefs. Douglas North has tried in every single book and a lot of others. And I don't know if in sociology if they've made more headway towards beliefs.
Yes, I don't really have questions because, yeah, you gave a good description of the evolution of the concepts. The definitions, only 2 comments. The first one is the fact that, well, you illustrate very well that institutions matter. I mean, it's because it has been they have been institutionalized as different disciplines that now it's so difficult. The institutions are difficult to change. You know, just 2 anecdotes to illustrate that. One is in France in the early 1990s, there was a big debate among economists to know if the emerging discipline of mathematical economics should remain within the economic discipline or should have structure of itself. We discussed that. And economists, and partly economists from the left side, Bernardo, put a lot of pressure to maintain mathematical economics within economics, thinking, well, we're going to dominate these guys. And the opposite happened because the small community of mathematical economics are much better organized, and they progressively capture the institutions appointing the economists. So, you know, in that sense, the institutions matter a lot, and I think that you gave illustration of that as well, you know, where you publish and where you can publish and so forth. The other comment is I'm not a good marketer. I'm not good at marketing. So you advertise your Journal of Institutional Economics, in which you're doing a good job and raising that issue of, you know, well, it's economics. I was confronted to the same problem with the complementary adventure, so to speak, the series I'm developing with Elgar. And initially, I thought, well, I'm going to call that New Institutional Economics series. And I thought, no, well, first, already, you know, New Institutional Economics may be a little restrictive, New Institutional may be restrictive, and economics is even more restrictive. So I changed it to New Institutional Economic Analysis, which is a way to go around. And I take that opportunity. I will circulate a flyer to advertise my series as well as your. I forgot to do that this morning.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to make a small question. Some authors use it to refer to economics as a branch of political science. So my question is, if so, where should the correlation of power, where is the room for the correlation of power? Should it lay in sociology, or is it in economics itself? Thank you very much.
Yeah, there were several comments, and I don't want to reply to every comment, particularly as I agree with most of them. So I'll deal with the two great questions about beliefs and the last one about power. I mean, they're interesting concepts to raise. Well, beliefs, there's now widespread discussion of beliefs in both disciplines, in sociology and in economics, but often the way that the notion of belief is addressed is different. I mean, sociologists typically talk about sort of values behind beliefs and associate beliefs with a value system and a culture. It's not the only way you do it in sociology, but that's one way it can be done in sociology. What economists typically do is to conflate beliefs with preferences, right? I mean, I'm not going to sort of criticize all that, but I mean, I think the key question, which is often ducked, really, is where do beliefs come from? How do we get them? And the answer they come from culture, I think, is a bit of hand-waving, and the answer to their preferences is also hand-waving. We need to know where our beliefs come from. And one reason that attracts me to the old institutional economists is that they are influenced by pragmatists, and the notion of belief was important for them, and the notion of habit as underlying belief was important. But that's my own view. That's less to do with the other thing. Now, the power also is very interesting, okay? In the Robbins definition of economics, power disappears because you're just taking the agent as they are, in the world as it is, maximizing his or her utility under the constraints presented with the scarce resources available, okay? And if someone's in power and someone's up, it's not relevant to that analysis, you just take it for given. So the origins of power are not really relevant to that argument, and power is one of the many constraints impinging on individuals, and you're more interested in the choice problem. But in the Marshallian view of economics, power is important, because economics is about the production and distribution of wealth, and production is about power, and distribution is about power. You know, concerns about income distribution, power of multinational companies, that kind of issue become central to a Marshallian view of the subject. So power has a place in sociology, quite rightly, and as a discipline always has had right from the beginning, but it also should be restored to economics, and I think we can both usefully discuss power. I mean, most of my understanding of power comes from reading sociologists, to be honest. I get more insight from reading sociological accounts of power than I have done from economists, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't have a place within economics or the unified discipline that we're talking about, because power is central to social life. And the meaning of power is important to understand, and the exercise and the change of power, possible changes in power relations are also important. So I think those are great questions, and I think they illustrate the kind of possibility of spanning. And I've emphasized the insularity of the two disciplines, but actually there's exceptional cases where there's thought transfer across. I mentioned the technique transfer of rational choice theory going from economics to sociology, followed by game theory going from economics to sociology. But another a concept that's gone the other way, quite interestingly, in modern economics, is identity. The identity concept comes from social psychology and sociology. It was developed by sociologists and has now been co-opted by a number of sort of marginal-ish but important economists, including people like Alan Kerman, who's in France but who's English. And Kerman is a kind of barometer figure for me. I think he tries to position himself in the mainstream, but actually what he says is really quite critical of the mainstream views. And so he's a kind of key figure, in my view, for understanding what's going on in economics. And the fact that he talks about identity is significant. That's an example of a useful transfer in the opposite direction.
And thanks a lot, Jeffrey. Let's give a hand to Jeffrey for his excellent presentation.